Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. The name of this panel is Telling Unlearned Lessons from the First Cyber Conflict Decade, 2010 to 2020. And our speaker today is Chris Demchuk. I'm going to give the floor to Chris.
Hello. I presume I can be heard, so I'm going to get started as soon as possible here. I've slightly changed the title. I am going to give you these unlearned lessons, but I'm also going to extend them on into what we're dealing with today in AI and end with an argument about needing collective cyber defense. So I didn't introduce myself. I suppose I should. I am the Grace Hopper Chair of Cybersecurity at the U.S. Naval War College. And I should say none of my remarks reflect anything from the U.S. government or my grandmother for that matter. All right. First, a little background. In the United States, we have always implemented connectivity between actors in a sort of systemically thoughtless fashion, right? Our railroad network spread across the country, bringing products everywhere, but we also recognize that it produced robber barons who stole farmland, who bought mines and poisoned the water for farms and streams and forced farmers to sell. And we just said, fine. We made telephone networks all over the country, connecting people very nicely. But hundreds of local telephone companies were forced to sell to AT&T in this wonderful process, and leaving the rural environment actually very underserved in general. And by the 1950s, this is AT&T, and it was such a monopoly that even a commercial that they put out in the 70s on reach out and touch someone was satirized as reach out and crush someone. By the 1980s, this had been enough, and the monopoly was actually broken up into smaller companies. Another one, the National Highway Network, of course, a good thing for security. We needed that. We wanted to have our ability to race across the country as needed. But what else did it do? It created this massive role for car companies, hollowed the cities into urban decay, cemented farmland and beautiful wildlands into extended suburbs where everyone had to drive to get somewhere, destroyed a rather efficient mass rail transport and inner city transport system, and of course, majorly contributed to pollution and climate change, right? So we don't think about these things systemically when we put them together. When you connect systems, you add complexity, and in this case, numbers, differentiation, and interdependence. So you add surprise, uncertainty, and depending on who's connected there, you add in conflict. So we built cyberspace, and we said exactly what we've always said: great for productivity. It's going to bring us peace and wonderness and a village marketplace, the exchange of ideas. Governments will fade away. Democracy will go everywhere. And instead, this is what we got, right? So we built this universal substrate that connected social, technical, and economic subsystems into, for each nation, a large-scale national socio-technical economic system. We call it a STAYS in our work, without anybody looking at the fact or doing something about the fact that it also brought in all along those connections, these threats from complexity, greed, neglect, and of course, adversaries. We left our whole socio-technical economic system basically unresilient against these threats. Now, how did that actually happen in cyberspace? A little background for folks who may not be studying this field. First off, it was built on extensively poor code, not only hubris, we're going to fix the whole world. So cyberspace is three elements: that connectivity, the content that travels along it, and the ideas that we get are built fundamentally on this poor code that's easy to hack, right? Easy for bad actors to put bad things in this code. There were alternatives. You could have basically error not tolerant languages, right? Memory safe languages, but they're not as cheap and quick and easy to do. But so we built the entire internet and your cyberspace on this. And it gave 5 offense advantages to everyone in the world who could connect to it. You could have any scale of organization that you liked for nearly free. You could be anywhere from 5 to 5,000 kilometers away from anyone and get high quality intelligence. You could choose any tool on the underground cyber market with whatever precision you wanted, hit one person, a city, half of a country. You could hide that tool, therefore save it. Well, maybe if no one can see you, and you can hide yourself and continue to do it. The consequences is we doubled the sources of systemic surprise for digital nations, from just being the normal complexity inside the country to adding in this huge community of bad actors able to reach into the country, plus adversaries and what's called the wicked actors, the persistent adversaries, the scary smart ones on the top. And we started having massive losses in wealth, of threatening the futures of democracy without any war, estimated to be 1 to 2% of GDP. You can ask me about it. I can talk about that later. That also accelerated the returns of scale and strategic coherence to major autocratic adversaries. If you can use this to steal that IP and then take over the market later, what a great advantage for the country, right? Especially China fully understood this quickly. So that created a new kind of conflict for us, cyber conflict, and it made cyber power suddenly made it a key to national power. And furthermore, it accelerated the emergence of this conflict between democracies and rising autocratic cyber-enabled powers, right? And we call that great systems conflict. We think it's a better, more accurate term than great power conflict. And it is a difficulty for democracies who haven't learned the lessons they need to learn, right? And so here's a quick model of that. It creates a vicious cycle of cyber conflict, which was left unrecognized and left intact. So here are offense advantages. Here are sources of systemic surprise. Here's the weak cyber power that comes from being unresilient and not prepared. Here's government trying to do something about it, but they don't change anything. And so the vicious cycle just goes on, right? So a couple of years ago, a colleague of mine, Francesca Spitaglieri, and I decided we would gather up experts and we would try and get some of these lessons in one document, which we published in the Cyber Defense Review in 2022. Here is a subset of those lessons. And I just want to run through them quickly because I want to get to the AI problem as well. Well, the first one is just that this cyber defense is in fact forever. You have to be persistent and forward-looking as long as that substrate is not transformed. What we have been doing up to now isn't working. Non-binding norms, because norms have to be things that come in international law after states already practice them. And only states can do this. We can't leave this to the private sector. And of course, a viable state cannot refuse to have some offensive cyber capabilities any more than it can refuse to defend itself physically, right? Now, we, as a community of consolidated democracies, we have to recognize also that we are a minority of states. We're less than the 10% of the world's population, and each of us alone face a huge adversary like China. We don't have the scale to do so. So defending alone leads to defeat over time. That is just the reality we have to understand. And we continue to suffer in a failure of imagination about what this world is going to look like, particularly against autocratic and assertive states like China. And we also have to have a reasonable expectations. I mean, this is a problem the US has, is we have to not only have allies, but we have to recognize what they give to us and what we need to give to them. This is a two-way street, right? Our national cyber defense has to be systemic. We've not really recognized this. We focused on the military. No, we also need everything else, including economic actors. Otherwise, we miss things. We have blind spots. And furthermore, government reinforcement is going to be necessary because of these systemic threats. You know, we can enforce liability insurance backup. Voluntary doesn't work in large-scale interlaced systems, right? What are we doing today? Well, we are actually repeating the same problems in AI development. Emerging technologies are cyber's offspring. They inherit their cyber parents' vulnerability. That substrate supports all that AI development, right? And much like the cyber parent, most of them, including, for example, machine learning development, is maturing before they secure themselves. And they exhibit the same threats and threat potentials, threat vectors that we see in cyber before AI, like data poisoning, like the model creation. What did you download to use this and make the model? Do you know how to validate it as you've already put it out there? Do you know how to monitor it? It can fail for a whole lot of reasons. Are you planning for doing that as well? Right? And then, of course, who's using it? What are the ethics of what they're doing, right? We also see a very similar problem from the early days of cyber. We have a massive independent AI, it's called the indie AI community. It's just producing AI and, to make money, to stick it in products with no particular security guardrails. And adversaries are taking advantage of that, this Wild West reality. A couple of years ago, an IBM researcher pointed out that they'd done a survey of 28 machine learning firms and found that 25 of them had no idea how to secure the models that they were putting out. So the kinds of things we see in cyberspace, we also see in AI: evasion attacks, privacy attacks, code injections, corrupted packages. And if you'll see my little pictures here, this is clearly a panda. You play around with the pixels a bit, and you get a gibbon, right? And that data, this is a gibbon, is now put into whatever program it's using, right? Yeah, you can trigger malicious guardrails. And of course, everyone knows about the famous deep fake of President Zelensky of Ukraine announcing the surrender of the country. Okay. And now we have another form of AI, and a term that everyone now needs to know: generative AI. And 2023 was their breakout year, and everybody wants to use it in one way or another. But there's no requirements for security with this. It's just like early cyberspace. And this, for those of you who don't know what generative AI is, the way to think about it is it's AI/ML. It's very often what's called large language models like ChatGPT and so on. But they have the capability to produce unexpected answers. You're asking for an answer, and they're going to normally it'll give you an answer with a certain statistical confidence on it. But this kind of generative AI just comes up with answers that you didn't ask, the questions that you didn't ask. That's a really big difference. Yeah. And similar problems in security. It's spreading everywhere. Look at the list here. I found this lovely chart by McKinsey. These are the industries that are at least trying it. Consumer goods, of course, energy, financial service, healthcare, pharma, medical, all kinds of telecoms and other advanced industry, right? So it is spreading everywhere, just like cyber did. No, with the security blind sites, uninhibited and security blind, right? Just like cyber. Right? So what do? We already know that we have the emergence of great systems conflict. We already know that we have unlearned lessons, and we already know that we are now rushing in to a world in which we're going to be surrounded by the cyber's offspring as well. We have to pay attention to what the adversary is doing in this world, not just what we're doing, right? So there's an overarching unlearned lesson that as long as we leave this vicious cycle of cyber conflict, now doubling down with AI and generative AI, we will be weak cyber powers across democracies, and this great systems conflict will continue. And scale will really matter. One of the things that we know is that China is intent upon dominating these offspring: machine learning, AI, quantum, and then massively investing in it, right? Coercively investing in it if necessary, but with an amazing strategic determination. It graduates more computer scientists in 1 year than the US does in all of STEM. And of course, it's been laying ownership and indirect control lines all over the world. I like to remind people that this particular autocratic state has been quite clear that it does not share our values, considers that this rise is a rise to its global rightful place in the world, and that the trend of the times that this is the Chinese century. All right, that will be extremely difficult for them to give that up. We have to recognize the threat to our own democracy in this cyber and digital world, right? We're always going to be a minority of states. And since we individually lack this demographic scale, and we're already in this great systems conflict, we need to think collectively to defend ourselves. So I'm going to end with an argument that we need a new narrative of minority, democratic, prosperous resilience. And that will require 3 operational goals. I call this the Cyber Operational Resilience Alliance, a CORA. The first one is we have to scale up, right? This is a joint defense across the 900 million plus, it's actually more than that, of the populations across consolidated democracies. Right? With a whole of society defense, it's federated through our and our allies, socio-technical economic systems, but it includes the private sectors. Right? It is feasible. We've already done it. We've done something similar with NATO and EU. And I highly recommend you look at the lessons coming out of Ukraine today with the support from the private sector. Right? We also need, yikes, we need not to do that. We also need to buy time, right? Because the rapidity with which this is happening, we have to move into a collective defense and coordinated collective defense as quickly as possible to defend the critical forms of our democratic IT market. We're already making progress on that. We're already trying to do it. But people have to be inside the tent and have to be on board for this. And that really includes the private sector for us. And across clouds, and of course, across cyber's offspring, AI, ML. As these guys expand everywhere, we have to think, okay, we're not going to make the same mistakes we did before. Now, it doesn't mean we don't trade vigorously, because we will trade vigorously. I'm not talking about a fortress. I'm talking about defense, right? And finally, we have to invest in the transformation. I always said cyber defense is forever. As long as we have this incredibly poorly coded, put together substrate, this continues. So we have to transform our tech. We have to invest massively in advanced IT. And that means laboratories, private sectors, universities. We have to view it as the problem, wartime tempo of R&D. And again, the lessons of Ukraine have something to teach us here, the Ukrainian response, right? So what do we have to do at the end of the day? We have to reconstruct and upgrade this substrate within the established democracies to something we meant it to be from the beginning: safe, innovative, and democratic internet, and also safe, innovative, democratic AI, ML, and so on. Right? This breaks the vicious cycle. And once we start breaking the vicious cycle, then we become robust cyber powers, and we have a much better chance of surviving in the future, given the hostile and more autocratic world we're likely to face, right? So, to my mind, this is the overarching lesson. That we have to do this collectively. And I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Chris. If anybody has any questions, please go ahead.
Does anyone here in the room have a question?
I talk too fast.
I don't have a question, just a comment. A very instructional presentation. eye-opening almost. I think I need to study it a good deal more before I can ask an intelligent question about it, except point us towards where we can do something about it.
Well, that's part of where my research is going right now. I've been talking about this for a couple of years, and the sad reality of Ukraine is that it became the great natural experiment. We saw our IT capital goods private sector folks, before we passed any laws, racing in to help Ukraine. So it turns out that they are open to working inside the tent with us and across nations. There's an interesting data set out of Yale, their Chief Executive Leadership Institute, where they tracked all the countries that left Russia, all the corporations that left Russia before any laws said they had to leave Russia, and 1,000 of them left, and they were largely from the consolidated democracies, and a great number of them are helping the Ukrainians. So we know there's a narrative out there that inspires folks to think about security, to contribute to it, to be willing to get inside the tent and still be innovative and still be making things and generative. And so the question is, how do we bring it together? And there are a number of people talking about this now. There are, and then there's people also working on transforming the underlying substrate. It's just in pieces. And, you know, my argument is when we think collectively, we think federated, but we also think of bringing it together, bringing those pieces together. So where do we start? That's where we're starting. And as it happens, ironically, Ukraine is making us do this.
Thank you, Chris.
That gave me another thought. That gave me one more thought. Of all of the areas that you were outlining, the areas we need to work on, many of them are soft. They take a lot of effort. You have to convince and change people's minds. Surely we know how to write secure code. Are there standards out there yet that we need to simply use and apply?
So we do, but the best way to understand this is from the outset, writing secure code took a long time, and you had to keep checking it, and that was considered too expensive. And it looks like I'm having a technical problem, but I think you guys can still see me. And that was considered too expensive. So what we have is embedded code all over the internet. That is 20 years worth, right? That's not secure. We're always finding another problem with it. And there are, you know, efforts here and there. I think it's IBM, forgive me if it's not. I think it's IBM that has a language F#, in which you can take your insecure application and you can run it through F#, and F# will pump out an application that's more secure. But this is right. This is 1 by 1 by 1 by 1 until about, I'm making a guess, but maybe 5 years ago at most, until about 5 years ago, you could get a 4-year degree in computer science in this country and never have a single course on cybersecurity. The word might be mentioned. It's worse in AI and ML, where that's data science, largely statistical. They don't get involved in, you know, what this network stuff kind of thing. So in principle, that's the concrete place to, you know, to start. In practice, it's all we don't have the time to redo the entire computer science curriculum across the country. You have to come in where they're at, which is a guy in the, you know, someone's been in the job for 15 to 20 years. We have to say, here's a narrative. This is why it matters that you pay attention to this. Here's some tools. This is why that matters. Here's some people to work with. This is why that matters. And keep that, you know, that narrative focused on, there's a reason why you're doing this.
Any other question, comment?
Thank you for the presentation. That was quite interesting. I was wondering, I really like the XKCD comment that you had at the end about sort of the critical aspects of infrastructure holding up the whole system. I was wondering if you could talk more about that, what you see as sort of those critical dependencies within the United States, as well as, like, you know, what techniques and methods do you see as more or less useful for finding and protecting those? Thank you.
Well, the critical dependencies are it's like asking the question of what is critical infrastructure. I think there are three critical infrastructures, and I got this from my good colleague and expert in this, Melissa Hathaway. That's telecommunications, energy, and finances. When you peel apart those three critical infrastructures, those are the places where you're going to find the adversaries, the criminals, and everyone else who wants to actually disrupt the operations of the country. So that's where our critical focus is. Now, it's not like we don't have a huge cybersecurity industry. We do. And we have some extraordinarily good threat hunters out there. And they have an extraordinarily overwhelming job. And unless something's changed, the average CISO, right, the Computer Information Security Officer in any corporation has a half-life of about 2 years before they get fired because they have a breach. So what can we do about it? There's a whole array of things they're already doing, from, you know, detection services, from threat hunting, from so on. But the difficulty is we have to do this systemically, because one by one, you can ensure that your firm is relatively protected, but you still have to buy products from someone who has downloaded software from their third-party producer, who is not using security minds, you know, any security thoughts, and they're putting things together. We have financial firms that buy cybersecurity firms and then tamp them down because they're too expensive. It has to be more systemic than that. And that's the reason I say we have to have this narrative of minority survival, because that's usually the one thing that will get people to stand up and go, okay, wait a minute, the whole survival, I got it. Otherwise, it's bolting on, and bolting on. And again, people are talking about this. I think the difference is what I'm saying, it has to be operational. That the private sector has to be the one who's in the tent doing this. I'm not sure I answered that question, because I have a feeling this is a question over coffee where we outlined products and lists and things like that. But I will say that one by one is an answer is not working.
Any other question, comment? No more questions here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everyone, for questions. We're going to end this session. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.